And I think the question for us is, what schedule are we following? What schedule, what rhythms do we already have in place? And are those schedules pushing us to discipleship with Jesus or pushing us towards something else? And what I've learned is a lot of frustration that people experience in following Jesus comes from this desire to grow, this desire to be like Jesus, to love him, to want to be with him, and then a schedule that is very opposite of that. And a schedule that really just looks like the rest of the world. And so there's like some certain beliefs that they have, and then as they walk around kind of the rest of the world, they like shove some like random spiritual disciplines in there, and they're just like miserable and tired all the time. It's like, well, I go to church, like I read a book every now and then. If I'm like super good, I'll like call a friend, and I have like my Bible app. But like really they're going around the same way everyone else is, and they're like their rhythms are exactly the same, but their desires are for something greater. And I've just been able to help and walk through with people like, hey, why don't you just schedule it this way? Or why don't you just pray when you do this? Or why don't you just begin to match things you already do with disciplines? And over time, they actually experience this freedom and release of their desires are actually now matched by their practices. Their desires are actually matched by the schedule they have. And so we need to ask ourselves, like, are we taking captive our schedule and our formation and actually planning out how we can pursue these things? Or again, are we just letting our schedule and letting our rhythms kind of just go with the flow or go by cultural norms, and therefore are we experiencing the fruit of either one of those? I think that is the tension that so many of us wrestle with, and I think that is the difference between quick burnout or unfaithfulness or struggle to make it the long haul like we talk about, and long-term discipleship is that consistency to show up every day with simple practices. And we're going to talk about what that can look like, because it's not rocket science. It's not this massive, we all need to go be monks and live in a mountain and throw our phones in a river and make significant changes. We can live the lives that we're currently living. It's just partnering the things we're doing with disciplines. So we're going to get there in a second. Really fast, I want to give a brief history of how we got to where we are now with Rule of Life. And this is going to be really fast. Basically, so the early church is exploding throughout Rome. This is going to be an incredible oversimplification, but at some point, Christianity becomes the official religion of Rome, which actually ends up becoming a bad thing for the Christian church, and they actually end up partnering kind of with the government, a lot of corruption, a lot of difficulty, a lot of cultural compromise. And a group of people began to see this cultural compromise and were so fed up with it that they actually fled. And they're called the Desert Fathers, and they actually went and lived in the desert, literally. And they began to kind of form these new communities around certain practices that they thought would actually lead to people, having deep relationships with Jesus. What's interesting is they fled society to get away, and they actually found that people kept coming to them. Like, people were so tired of how things were going in Rome that they actually went with them out into the desert and began to actually form these communities around the practices of Jesus, around prayer, scripture reading, fasting. They did a few other things that kind of were fit for their time. And so, a number of church fathers, and really began to take real shape with Saint Benedict. Saint Benedict was kind of the first one to write down an official rule of life for the early church. And then they just started this monastic movement where people were going to live in monasteries and live in communities, and they're going to intentionally pray and do certain practices. And then they felt convicted. They're like, well, we're out in the desert. And they realized, they're like, oh, we retreated from society to kind of get deformed from society. And now we actually feel called to go back into society. And they went back into Rome and began to form those communities within the city, within the area, and practice those same practices together, but actually invite more people in. What's really interesting is we're not too far away from St. Patrick's Day, which for us is just like, you just wear green and, depending on who you are, probably no one in this room, go to bars. We forget, we don't realize that St. Patrick actually was kind of the father of the first massive church planting movement throughout Europe. And he just started planting monasteries, started in Ireland, then it kind of moved its way all the way into more of Rome and throughout Europe, where he just started planting monasteries And basically they just prayed together, they fasted together, they read scripture, and they just took care of the poor. That's basically all they did. And people kept coming to them, and people kept coming to them, and then people would be like, oh, I want to go to this area. So like, all right, you three, like go to that area. And they'd go and they'd pray, they'd fast, they'd read scripture, and they would take care of the poor. And like lo and behold, like monasteries start popping up all over Europe. And actually that's kind of what it becomes what we know as like the monastic movement actually comes from that. And it's just a group of people being like, we're fed up being like everybody else. So let's just get together. Let's do these things. Let's live this common rule of life. Let's take care of the poor and let's see what happens. And like it spread everywhere. And it wasn't necessarily like major, it wasn't even like necessarily the intention. That wasn't necessarily even the goal. And the reason why I say all that is because when we get together and we practice these things as a community, it does more than just us feel good or us feel aligned with our schedule or us feel like we're on track with where we want to go. It's actually an attractive way to live. Like people don't want to be burned out, anxious, exhausted, angry, all of those things. They want to live a full life. And living by a rule of life, I think actually helps us do that and display that to the world and produce fruit that allows us to invite other people in. And that's how a lot of the early church grew, was practicing a shared rule of life. And now we, as 21st century Americans, I think like we can walk in this quote that I'm about to read from Dietrich Bonhoeffer and actually really see that we actually have a time like this needs something like this probably more than ever. And so Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, this was in 1940, he said the renewal of the church will come from a new type of monasticism, which only has in common with it the old and uncompromising allegiance to the Sermon on the Mount. It is high time people banded together to do this, and he says, ancient practice. So what he's saying is he read a lot of the Desert Fathers, he read a lot of that early church, and he was like, he looked at the church in the West and where it was going in the 1940s, and he was like, if the church is going to like actually become what it's supposed to become, like we need people to actually not try to figure out new ways to live, but actually go back to a really old way of living and just figure out how to do it in modern society. And I think that's what we are pressed and called to do now, is not try to reinvent the wheel, not try to figure out what might work today into the 21st century, but rather, hey, let's go back and live similarly, but actually just with our modern times, with how we live now, with that actually makes sense and weaves into what it looks like to be a 21st century American in Lynchburg, Virginia. And I think that's what the kind of the call that we have. And that's why I'm so passionate about a rule of life, because I've actually seen it not just benefit my life, but benefit those around me. And like little kids like really benefit from schedules. If you don't give a little kid a schedule, it like stresses them out. They actually like it's worse for them. Having routine, having expectations, having that schedule. And I think for a lot of us, we might feel like we're in that infancy stage of discipleship to Jesus. And I think the next step for you is creating that structure, creating that schedule, creating realistic expectations for yourself, and seeing that actually grow and mature over time.